To make my personal feelings and biases clear from the start, I like all of these knight candidates. I've heard some really awesome and compelling arguments and theories for literally every single one of these guys. However, recently, when gathering evidence for the knight's identity, I noticed several conflicting pieces of information against pretty much every major knight candidate that I feel like nobody's really talking about, or at least that people aren't considering all at once. And even when some of this information is brought up, I feel like it's not being considered at the same time as other counter evidence for other knight candidates. I feel like if we can gather all this evidence in one spot, like this video, we can use that to more usefully whittle away different knight candidates, which will hopefully ultimately bring us closer to the truth. Before I move forward with this, I just want to say again, I like all these theories, and nothing in this video is intended to be targeted against, anybody's theories in any way. I'm just looking at the evidence and presenting my conclusions. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you have supporting or counter evidence for any of your favorite knight candidates that you feel overwrites any of the information I'll be presenting in this video. Alright, okay. Without further ado, here's... Now this one is kind of a joke theory, but there is a subsect of the fandom that does truly believe in it, and I actually was one of them in the chapter 2 days. I was a Papyrus Knighter for a little while before I became a Kris Knighter. GG Kris Knight. GG Kris Knight, but hey. And like I said, most people say this one as a joke, but there actually is like genuine counter evidence for this theory, and it's not just the, the obvious horns. So in chapter 1, Sans states that he and his brother only recently moved to town. In chapter 4, Rousey states that the reason Susie isn't able to bring the old man back to life in her dark world is because, quote, darkness patterned after the memory of a loved one tend to only appear in specific darknesses. This clearly suggests that the knight, the creator of the first and third Sanctuary Dark Fountains, is someone who had some kind of deep bond with Gerson. Sans and Papyrus cannot have such a bond with Gerson because he was already dust by the time they arrived in town. Because of this, my verdict is that Papyrus Knight is, unfortunately, impossible. The second candidate I'll be discussing is Asriel. To put it very simply, Asriel cannot be the knight because he's at college. I know. Asriel Knighters must be tired of hearing this, and I'm aware that the premise of Asriel Knight is that he's secretly not actually at college. But I actually have some supporting information for my claim. The first piece of evidence is that in chapter 2, Kris has, quote, summer vacation college when in their search history in Queen's room. Kris and the knight are clearly working together, and it is clear that they know who's behind the mask, thanks to that scene in chapter 4 where you can imagine the knight taking the helmet off and Kris thinks of Jockington instead. So my question is, why would Kris search this if they knew Asriel was already home and operating as the knight? I suppose that you could say that since Kris knows who the knight is, they could have intentionally searched this before the chapter 2 Dark World specifically to throw off the player. As we know, they don't want the player to know who the knight is. I'll say that this is possible, but I don't really see the point of including this text at all if it was intended to just be a red herring like that. At that point, why not just have Kris search something unrelated to Asriel? However, the piece of evidence I think is actually stronger than that is to do with Sans. So in chapter 2, Sans states regarding Kris meeting Papyrus, quote, I'm sure you'll meet him someday, maybe around when your brother comes home? This line reads to me as Toby using Sans to convey to the player that we won't meet Papyrus until much later in the game, and to not expect him until the mysterious time next week, which is now the current week in universe, when Asriel returns. I genuinely do not see what other kind of purpose this line serves if not for that. Before I move on from this piece of evidence, this is not actually in the script, I just thought of something. I think the reason that Kris looks up when summer break is that they might be too shy to ask Asriel directly, which might seem strange, but it does account for the fact that Kris obviously is not directly asking Asriel when he'll be back for some reason. Like they feel the need to Google this instead of just asking him directly. And this must have been before the internet went down. So I think this does make sense, and it does kind of align with how Kris is characterized. There's plenty of moments where Kris is definitely portrayed to be shy. But if you have another explanation for this, definitely let me know in the comments. Okay, so anyway, taking both the fact that Kris is looking up when Asriel will return and the fact that Sans implies Papyrus will appear alongside Asriel in the story when he comes home, as well as the multiple mentions now from Toriel about Asriel coming home, I do not see how Asriel being the knight would be the intention when the story is pointing against it so blatantly. I'm probably going to say this again later in the video, but I don't think Toby explicitly lies to the players I think he tries to mislead us, but there's multiple pieces of information now saying, yeah, Asriel's at college. He's coming home next week. And now Asriel coming back is for some reason being tied to Papyrus re-entering the story or entering the story in the first place. That specifically feels like such a strange detail if he's intended to be the knight who's technically already come home in chapter 3. So with that being said, I don't think we can say Asriel is the knight either. So next is Carol. So Carol is a very popular contender for the Roaring Knight. One of the big three, I'd say, alongside her daughter and husband. I do have a few points against her being the knight, some more immediately obvious than others. My first big one is the chapter 4 Dark Worlds. In chapter 4, right before Kris and Susie can go to the Dark World in the church, Carol pulls Noel into the kitchen for a lecture. By the time Kris and Susie enter the Dark World is not only already made, but the knight can be seen in the flesh right after you enter. Because of this, I don't think it's possible for Carol to be the knight. And I'm just gonna say, yes, I know she came out of the kitchen to say, as you know, you are always welcome here, to Kris, but I don't see why she wouldn't just be going straight back into the kitchen to continue lecturing Noel after that. It's not like she runs past Kris like, oh, I got somewhere to be. One counterpoint I've seen is that maybe there's a secret tunnel from the Holiday Manor to the church, which would explain how Carol shows up so quickly as the knight. But one, there's little evidence for the secret tunnel, and two, Carol was lecturing Noel. I imagine that lecture would take a while, especially since it was regarding Noel letting a stranger play with her missing sister's guitar. In my opinion, it would be awkward for Carol to pull Noel into the kitchen and then immediately leave to take a secret tunnel to the church. I think Toby would have to clearly establish later in the game that this tunnel even exists for this to work. Let's also note that the knight seems to be spending most of its time in the Dark Worlds of chapter 4 either searching for something or stalling the heroes or not doing anything that we can actually quantify right now. At that point, Carol could have just stayed home and used that time to lecture Noel anyway. Now I will say there is the slowed down, I believe it's Muse_smile in the basement that could indicate some kind of secret tunnel, but considering that's the sound of the shelter, I think it just indicates that the shelter stretches underneath the Holiday Mansion. The game has made several mentions at this point of something foreboding being underground / beneath town. I believe this is another one of those suggestions. So this is off script, but I think if Toby and the team wanted to portray that there is some link between specifically the church and the holiday house, I think it would have made sense to have some kind of unique ambience track that plays in the basement of the Holiday Manor that also plays, I don't know, in the dark world of the church or something. So then if you're really paying attention, you can be like, oh, these buildings are connected somehow, or there's something going on here. I think that would have been clearer than using the sound of the shelter. So that's honestly my major counterpoint, but there's other stuff too. So there's also the fact that Carol is barely taller than Susie, and the knight is repeatedly being hinted at as being a quote-unquote large person, and the fact that the knight was close with Gerson, which there isn't really much in the text to suggest Carol had a relationship with him. You could say this about Des too if you wanted to argue against Des Knight, but we can at least gather that Des might have been in Gerson's class, which would give her an opportunity to build a relationship with him. There's not really much suggesting Carol and Gerson could have had a relationship. Not to say it's impossible, but you know. Finally, there's also the fact that in chapter 5, Carol is investigating down south of town, which is where the shelter is. There are a few questions raised regarding this if Carol were intended to be the knight. One, why would Carol, as the knight, be investigating the shelter? The knight presumably already knows what's going on down there, as they seem to be working from within it, or at least they're taking people to it and can freely access it. And two, if Carol is the knight and also investigating the shelter, why would she do that in broad daylight? She could do it at night when everyone's asleep. And the knight actually has moved mostly at night or towards the end of the day so far in the story. So that just seems a little counterintuitive if she's also the knight. Honestly, this all seems to imply that, like Asgore, Carol is at least somewhat in the dark about the truth regarding whatever is going on with this conspiracy. Which would make sense as she does have a conspiracy board of her own in her room that Asgore can visit freely. So it seems like they're on at least mostly the same page. Rudy Knight. To start with the obvious, Rudy was injured at the end of chapter 5, and this injury was significant enough that Carol had to call Noel about it. Generally, Rudy's health has been declining throughout the game, and this moment seems to be the point where it starts to take an explicit turn for the worst. So what I'm basically saying here is that Rudy's too unhealthy to be the knight. That being said though, I am aware of a few counterpoints to that argument. One is that Rudy is faking his illness, and the other is that being the knight is causing his illness. Firstly, I'm going to dismiss the idea that Rudy is faking his illness. I simply cannot see Toby Fox writing a character evil enough to do that. If this is the crux of your argument, I'm just simply not going to engage with your argument. It would be one thing if Rudy had been characterized to be sneaky or deceitful, but he's kind of being characterized the opposite way. So this twist would come out of nowhere, and it would just make him a terrible person. At that point, he'd just be being the villain just to be the villain. Secondly, Rudy's not alive in Undertale, but Des is. This is significant because it implies something about the holidays situation in Undertale has allowed Des to survive, but Rudy not to, and vice versa in Deltarune. Now my theory for why that is that in Deltarune, Des met some sort of terrible fate in a dark world, cutting her life short. In Undertale, there wouldn't have been a dark world, so she got to survive to see the sun in true pacifist, which Asgore says in the alarm clock dialogue. Now that explains Des, but what about Rudy? For Rudy, him being alive in Deltarune and being dust in Undertale reads to me as Toby using Undertale, or I guess to be specific, the alarm clock dialogue, to foreshadow his fate in Deltarune. Let's remember that Rudy is sick with an illness in Deltarune, and that as of chapter 5, his health is getting worse. I don't really see why Toby would write Rudy as dust in Undertale / the alarm clock dialogue, but have him be alive and sick in Deltarune. Asgore states in the alarm clock dialogue that, quote, "One day he started looking older than I," and that, quote, "Suddenly, one day he fell down." This reads to me as Rudy facing some kind of health decline in Undertale, just as he does in Deltarune. If being the knight is what causes his sickness, then was he supposed to be the knight in Undertale too? It just doesn't make sense to me, because he could have just been alive in Undertale off screen, instead of writing him to have a health decline and then to pass away, and then in the next game to write him as having a health decline. Lastly, regarding Rudy, his general characterization in Deltarune is that he seems to be the only significant character in town to come to some sort of peace about Des. Noel is still clearly thinking about her quite intensely. Carol is investigating the conspiracy likely tied to her disappearance, even years later, and not many other characters even mention her. But Rudy is in the unique situation where he brings Des up without indicating that he is still completely consumed by her loss. All this being said, I don't see the point in writing a character who has made peace with what is likely the center tragedy of the game, just for them to actually be a villain working behind the scenes to presumably undo or circumvent said tragedy. And I mention that specifically because, as far as I've seen, the core motivation for Rudy in Rudy Knight theories is that he's trying to bring Des back or find Des or something. Would it be cool if Rudy were the knight? Yes, of course, it would be awesome. And again, I've seen some excellent takes regarding Rudy Knight. But beyond being awesome, because of the reasons I mentioned, it seems to me to fall apart under deeper scrutiny. Let's consider also the narrative potential of the only person in Hometown to truly move on from the tragedy, the same person to be Noel's primary emotional support, and the same person currently keeping Carol from bothering Susie and Noel to pass away. That situation sounds ripe for conflict, and I can easily see Toby and his team moving forward with the rest of the game and taking advantage of that character drama. So Kris-Noel Knight wasn't in the script originally, but I feel like I should say something about it. Okay, so firstly, again, I think Kris-Noel Knight is cool. It's like as a concept, it's cool. It's just cool. And I think that's why a lot of people are drawn to it. But I will say, there's that relationship with Gerson thing. Once again, I feel like we kind of have to take all the evidence at once. Kris and Noel have no hinted relationship with Gerson, as far as I know. And even though he was a school teacher, based on some dialogue from some NPCs, now I will say, I saw this in the dialogue dump, but I do not know which NPCs this were. Feel free to let me know in the comments. But it seems like those NPCs, which seem to be a little bit older than Kris and Noel, they had him as a teacher when they were growing up. So it seems like there's a distinction between Gerson being a teacher and then his students growing up and then him passing away. And then Kris and Noel getting to that same age, but him already being gone. Now, I could be wrong. There could be a lore dump in chapter 6 or 7 about how Kris and Noel were really close with Gerson, but I don't really feel like that works right now. And at that point, I think it would have to be written so that Gerson was close to both Noel and Kris, and there just isn't set up for that. At least not yet. Kris-Noel Knight doesn't really meet the Gerson criteria, so I can't really seriously consider it. It's kind of like Papyrus Knight, actually. Actually, low-key, we should use Gerson knowing the Knight as criteria for every single Knight candidate that we talk about. I don't think any Knight candidate works if they don't, meet that criteria. That's one of the very few confirmed solid pieces of information about the Knight that we have. So I feel like that should be really seriously considered when we propose new candidates. Last but not least is Death Knight. I'm going to be really honest with you right now. I'm going to be really frank with you. I don't really have what I feel like are smoking guns here, like how I did with the other Knight candidates. I feel like there's multiple strong pieces of information pointing against every single other Knight candidate, except for this one. However, I do have some small pieces of evidence that might imply it's not likely for her to be the Knight, but honestly, they can be explained away pretty easily. Now, I promise this video is not secretly Death Knight propaganda, but the facts have led me to Death Knight seeming to be at least more likely than any of the other popular candidates we have right now. So here's some information that I found that could work against Death Knight. The Spampton sweepstakes suggest that Des is lost and therefore must be found. However, the Knight is clearly not only present, but also sentient and capable of planning. So it seems Des's mind and body are still together, which doesn't leave much to be found except for, I guess, restoring her original appearance. But if that were the case, then why is it find her? The Knight might have been active years ago, according to chapter 5. You can actually interpret this piece of information from the chapter to indicate that Des's disappearance coincided with the creation of the Knight, making this Death Knight evidence after all. But I'm listing it here since you can also go the other way and use this information as proof against Death Knight, if you want. Des doesn't seem like a quote-unquote large person. However, this could be debunked if we are to see her in the light world at all at any point. So this one's pretty weak. So yeah, I'm not going to say Des is the Knight, but it does seem like she's the only popular candidate that doesn't have really hard counter evidence like the other ones do. Papyrus wouldn't have the opportunity to know Gerson. Asriel's at college, and Sans knows somehow that we'll meet Papyrus when he gets home from college. Rudy is on his way out, just as he was in the Undertale universe, and I don't really see the point of mentioning that he existed in the Undertale universe at all, if that's not the case. Carol can't physically make it to the church, and her investigation of the shelter in broad daylight wouldn't make sense if she is the Knight and knows what's in there. And as for Des, she is honestly unaccounted for and can easily be the Knight. That being said, if you can think of any hard Des not Knight evidence, definitely let me know though. My only issue with Death Knight as a theory is that the community has spammed it so hard since 3 and 4 dropped last year that I'm honestly tired of hearing it. Now, it is a very solid theory with tons of evidence, but it's the kind of thing that I'd want to go into the game and be surprised by. But now that the fandom has spread it so much, I feel like it's going to take away from some of the impact of the reveal, for me at least. It is a very solid theory. I'll even say that to argue for any other Knight candidate is to argue with the fact that Kris and some girl literally created the Darkners of chapters 1 through 3, the fact that a hand pushes Kris forward in chapter 4 while a muted guitar sound plays, the strange baseball imagery in some of the Dark Worlds, the Knight manifesting their weapon to appear like a bat in chapter 3, and a lot of other strong evidence. But again, this is not a Death Knight video. If you have good evidence for any of the Knight candidates, including but not limited to Des, I'd love to hear it in the comments. So those are my arguments. To be clear, I think all of these Knight candidates are cool. I just think to argue in favor for most of them requires some leaps in logic that I'm not satisfied with. I'm not seeing many people discussing these counterpoints, at least not all together, so I wanted to make this video and put them out there myself. So I have it in the script to say that this is my first Deltarune theory video, but thinking about it now, this kind of isn't really a theory. It's actually just debunking other theories while giving a little bit of evidence for and against Death Knight. So I don't know what you call this video, but it is my first Deltarune video. And if you guys want to see more, definitely let me know. I actually have a ton of ideas for other videos, and if the reception to this one is good, I'll definitely make those. But alright, that's all for now. If you're still watching at this point, please like and subscribe, and I don't know if you can hype on this channel, but if you can, please do that. Also, check out my other stuff. I usually make Minecraft maps actually, but I'm branching out a little bit today. I do have trailers for a bunch of them on my channel if you're interested. So if you are interested in that kind of thing, definitely go check those out. And yeah, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching.